I'm Professor Wallace, and I want to welcome you to this program, the latest in a series on Latin American security concerns. It's interesting. Latin countries are our neighbors. We share a hemisphere with them, and we know remarkably little about them, I would say, compared to other parts of the world, and know very little about their security problems. At this point, as I always do, I will turn the program over to Yona and keep my fingers crossed that he can stay with us for a long time. But in any case, Yona, welcome.
Okay, thank you very much, Don, as always, for hosting this event, many events over the decades. So very quickly, in the interest of time, you mentioned correctly, the topic. So obviously, as I try to share the information with our colleagues, obviously Latin America continues to be in front pages related to multiple political, social, economic, health, security concerns, including issues related to leadership, corruption, criminal activities, terrorism, human rights abuses, and the list continues. All those, as all of us know, threaten both regional and global stability concerns. So we're delighted to have a very distinguished interdisciplinary experts to deal with these issues and to look at the future strategic outlook and hopefully offer a recommendation, as we always try to do, to learn something from the past in order to craft some best practices, response strategies, if you will, but not only by governments, but governments and obviously also the intergovernmental, the international community in general, but also very importantly, non-governmental bodies, particularly the role of the public, how to deal with these issues. So we have a very distinguished panel, and usually what we try to do, we introduce them briefly, all the speakers, and later on we call upon the presenters according to the program that we listed. So then we have the presentations brief for about 10 or so minutes or a little more. Once we cover all the presenters, then we'll develop a Q&A discussion and so forth. So what I would like to do before I ask the speakers to make their presentation, I would like to again to welcome David Mizrahi, who is a senior advisor and attorney in the Republic of Panama, Ambassador Lino Gutierrez, who is a former U.S. ambassador to Argentina and Nicaragua, as well as acting Assistant Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere Affairs, distinguished Professor Emeritus Jaime Susliki, the University of Miami, and currently Director of the Cuban Studies Institute. Then Andrew Rodman, Director of the Mexican Institute at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And last but not least, Bruce Zagaris was a partner at Berliner, Cochrane, and Rowe firm. Now, before I introduce the first speaker more in detail, and hopefully we can put also the bios on the screen, I wanted to mention very quickly that when I discussed this particular event, some of my students and colleagues and others asked, am I going to also focus on the soccer world games and try to predict who is going to be the champion, particularly because of the Latin America excellent teams that we know. So I'm not going to predict. At least I would like to mention that those of you who had the opportunity to watch yesterday's game between the United States and Iran is very interesting in many ways. And I'm mentioning this because as we're going to discuss the Latin America security concerns as we intend, we also recall that this year is the 40th anniversary of the establishment of the Hezbollah, probably the most dangerous terrorist group in the world. And their Latin American connections are obviously well known. Obviously, we recall the attacks that took place in Buenos Aires in 1992, the attack on the Israeli embassy, and then on the AMIA, the community Jewish building there in 94, and so forth. So I think we try to remember the past in order to learn something about the future. And again, I think we remember that all the way back in 1979, the U.S. Embassy in Tehran was attacked, and we had a program last month or so in regard to the Iranian issue, and we had participants who were at the embassy at the time. So again, with this, I would like to introduce our first speaker, David Mizrahi, that I had the honor to meet him decades ago at the Hebrew University, where I was teaching a few courses on terrorism, and he came from abroad to study with other students. Now, David, we have this on the screen, so I won't read, obviously, the bio, very distinguished, but mention again his law, distinguished law practice, also his academic work dealing with many universities, United States and Latin America and elsewhere, and also to mention his public work and contributions related to some of the issues that we're going to deal with, all the way from civic, ethical, and moral values. And finally, a very distinguished education that I would like to mention is degrees in economics from the University of Pennsylvania, and Juris Doctor cum laude from Tulane University's Law School, and the Masters of Laws on the Global Business Law at Columbia University Law School. So with that, David, take over and provide some of your thinking about the topics and issues that we should consider today.
Thank you very much, Professor Alexander. And indeed, it is an honor to be part of this program. I want to thank you for inviting me. As you mentioned, I was your student at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem exactly 35 years ago. Very honored to be here. And the idea that 35 years ago you were teaching a course for non-Israeli students on terrorism as a political tool. Again, this is 1987. So you've always been ahead of the game. This is way, way before 9/11, when there wasn't quite the same type of awareness of terrorism and what a threat it is to society and to mankind as a whole. So I'm going to start by looking briefly at the main topic, which is Latin American security concerns, and it's rather broad. I will look at certain generic issues, and then I will focus, of course, in the one area where I claim to have a little bit of knowledge, which is my home country, Panama. So even though I was educated in the United States, I've lived in Panama most of my life, and I've practiced law in Panama for the past almost 30 years. So it's important to know why I will be focusing on Panama, while at the same time not neglecting the general topics which you've so aptly proposed. So I will start by looking at what the threats or what the security concerns are. What are the threats and what are the best practices? Of course, this being an area that's in constant flux, it's not something that we can have a straight answer. Yes, security is essential for human survival. Security is essential for societies to remain as such, and society is essential to security is essential to coexist in a world with many actors and with many factors. What are the threats? The first threat in terms of security, and there's no specific order, but I'd like to go by order of magnitude, is of course warfare. Warfare takes two forms, conventional and non-conventional. Luckily, in this hemisphere, we haven't had that direct security threat for at least during my lifetime. I was born in 1967. So a major regional conflagration has not been on the books. We've been able to coexist as nations in this hemisphere relatively peacefully. And I say relatively because there's other type of security threats that we have experienced firsthand, and that perhaps do not reach the level of warfare what we've seen in the Middle East, what we're seeing now in the former Soviet Union, what we see in other continents. There are security threats of a lesser magnitude, but by no way are threats that are negligible. These are threats that are real and that we need to deal as nations sharing this hemisphere, which I like to call the peaceful hemisphere. This is the one hemisphere where there's only one nuclear power. That's it. And there's nuclear non-proliferation. And the one attempt to bring nuclear weapons from elsewhere was done with diplomatically over 60 years ago. So looking at Latin America during my lifetime, yes, we've had to deal with terrorism. You mentioned the terrorist acts which took place in Argentina. I need to mention that there's also a connection with Panama. There was an airplane in 1994 that was blown up in the sky, and it has been connected to the same type of terrorist activities which you described and the same organizations which you described at the beginning. So it's not something that escapes even a very tiny country like Panama. But then terrorism itself is a very complex term because it depends on who's using the term. I've heard, and I'm sure you have too, people who refer to an anarchist as a terrorist, an insurgent as a terrorist. Others refer to freedom fighters or to people that are referred as terrorists as freedom fighters. Others refer to themselves as guerrillas and not terrorists. Others simply refer to the political opposition as terrorists. And finally, a term which I find is very in vogue in Latin America since the 1960s, and it's the word revolutionary. Now, what does that mean? I'd like to go into a little bit of anecdotes, because in Panama, I was born in 1967, and there was a coup d'etat in 1968, in 69, sorry, in 68, apologies, by the military, and it was virtually bloodless, yet they called themselves the revolutionary government. Now, what kind of a revolution was it? It was a social revolution. So revolution is not necessarily a call to arms by the people. Then we have, for example, much later in Venezuela, the current government of Venezuela calls itself, actually the country is called the Revolutionary Republic of Venezuela. The Bolivarian Revolutionary Republic of Venezuela, whatever you want to call it, the term revolution has been used and abused across the hemisphere. Of course, the Cuban Revolution is probably the most famous of, but I can tell you that in Panama, when I was growing up, there was the revolutionary government, which there was really no revolution. There was a coup d'etat, period. Another threat to security is criminality across borders. Probably the most patent one is drug trafficking, which spans the entire hemisphere with consumption in the north and production in the south. We will look at some maps later. And all that is connected to drug trafficking under that denomination of criminality. So, for example, money laundering is tied originally to drug trafficking. Now it's tied to terrorism. As I said, there's no set boundaries in this definition. Then we have political instability. When you do not have democracy, when you do not know what to expect during elections, when governments do not respect that they are entrusted temporarily with managing the public good, then we have political instability, and that is a risk. That is a latent risk and a patent risk to security in our nations. Human rights violations are also a risk, and I like to look at it in three dimensions. Lately, the one we've been feeling the most throughout the hemisphere, and this is not a problem of the United States and of Canada alone. This is a problem of the entire hemisphere, is immigration. If we do not have immigration controls, we cannot guarantee a secure environment in our countries. And the flow of immigrants that is coming not only from the hemisphere. In Panama, for example, in the border with Colombia, we're holding thousands of immigrants or refugees, many of whom have nothing to do with this hemisphere. They come from Africa, they land in South America, and they want to get to the United States, so they use the hemisphere as a corridor. And along the way, that presents a lot of threats. There's economic threats. Who will take care of those human beings? After all, they're human beings. There's men, women, children, old people, babies going across borders, and there needs to be border control, and there needs to be some sort of unified front to deal with this immigration crisis. Inequality across the hemisphere, we have huge inequality between countries. Number one, there's a country like Haiti, and there's a country like Chile within the same hemisphere. And they're all part of Latin America, let's call it. Why do we have all these huge inequalities across nations and within nations? Forget about situations like Haiti compared to Chile, or Haiti compared maybe to Peru. That's also, interestingly, a prosperous country that also faces other security threats, including terrorism, which has been fought over the past 30 years. But in the distribution of wealth, we have issues, again, both internal and regional. Poverty is rampant in the hemisphere. We cannot close an eye that to the extent there's poverty, there's insecurity, there's social insecurity, to the extent people are not able to earn a decent living and to live with dignity. Finally, lawlessness. When states do not control what their inhabitants do and what they do to others, and what they do when they move borders, then we have a security problem. Now, best practices, each one, I'd like to tie up each of the threats with a solution. Warfare, of course, diplomacy is the best way to deal with warfare, but real, honest diplomacy, not a facade of diplomacy, but good intentions, the way bilateral and multilateral treaties are negotiated and enforced. With terrorism, we need to work very hard at preventing the financing of terrorism and the arming of these terrorist groups and their infiltration into our hemisphere. With criminality, we need to create policies that both punish and deter criminality, so that there will be no incentive, that there will be a disincentive to engage in those activities. With political instability, we need to focus on democracy, on creating a democratic environment for people to feel safe. With human rights, we need to strive towards equality. We need to work towards fair immigration policies with appropriate controls. We need to work on human development to ensure economic fairness. Finally, with lawlessness, and this is perhaps the one issue upon which I have some sort of minor expertise, we need to work, and this is what the ILI does daily. We need to look and to work and to reinforce the rule of law across each and every nation in the hemisphere. That is the ultimate key that ties together all the best practices. Now, as I promised, I'm just going to look briefly into the case of Panama. I'm going to touch upon only a few of these threads and best practices. Try to refresh your memory. I see that we have distinguished scholars who probably know more about Panama than I do, but I would like to look briefly into some aspects which touch upon Panama. Number one, with Panama, it's the geography. This is the best map I could find to show you how the world's most important trade routes all converge in Panama. So the Isthmus of Panama is this small strip of land that's in the middle that basically joins North America to South America. It is within what is called Central America, which is like a transitionary zone. But Panama is literally the navel of our hemisphere. Others say that it's actually the navel of the universe. So I have issues with that because my grandfather was born in Jerusalem. But the navel of the universe, if we look at Panama, is Panama. And this is where the major trade routes, this is where world commerce comes together. This is where goods come from one place and make it through to another place. This is the actual strategic importance of the Isthmus of Panama. Its position as a crossroads and the importance of keeping it safe and secure, keeping the Republic of Panama safe and secure, ensuring that peace reigns in Panama, ensures that goods flow, and that the entire world is secure with access to consumer goods, to foodstuffs, to fuel. That is why in 1979, the Panama Canal treaties were implemented after a negotiation between the United States and Panama. The United States, since 1904, had been built the Panama Canal and ran it as an enclave of the United States in Panama. It was, I do remember, because of course I was born in 1967, that there were two different sets of police forces. Of course, up until 1999, there were American armed forces stationed in Panama. And why? Well, the answer we saw in the map. We need to ensure the free flow of goods. And with that, together with the Panama Canal Treaty, which was a treaty that reverted the canal and its facilities to Panama, there was a treaty concerning the permanent neutrality and operation of the Panama Canal. It has it's called the Neutrality Treaty, but it's not about neutrality. It's about ensuring security, ensuring safe passage. And it has a sort of dichotomy or a sort of contradiction, because it says that only Panama may maintain military forces in the canal and in Panama after the Americans leave. By the way, the Americans left in 1999. Yet, Article 4 of that treaty, of the Neutrality Treaty, says that the United States of America and the Republic of Panama agree to maintain the regime of neutrality established in this treaty, which shall be maintained in order that the canal shall remain permanently neutral, notwithstanding the termination of any other treaties entered into by the two contracting parties, being the United States and Panama. Now, what does that mean? I was able to look at documents from the President Jimmy Carter's presidency, and the statement he made after the Neutrality Treaty was agreed in 1977. Again, it was implemented, took force in 1979, and it was fully implemented in 1999, the canal treaties. But the Neutrality Treaty is still a binding international treaty. And this is what President Carter had to say, a joint statement with General Torrijos, who was then the head of state. Says, under the treaty concerning permanent neutrality and operation of the Panama Canal, the Neutrality Treaty, Panama and the United States have the responsibility to assure that the Panama Canal will remain open and secure to ships of all nations. Then they add, the correct interpretation of this principle is that each of the two countries shall, in accordance with their respective constitutional processes, defend the canal against any threat to the regime of neutrality, and consequently shall have the right to act against any aggression or threat directed against the canal or against the peaceful transit of vessels through the canal. That illustrates that the Panama Canal is of utmost importance, and that its security allows intervention or military intervention to defend the neutrality. Finally, I like to contrast these two maps with the original map. One was a map of Panama as the main hub for international trade. The next map, which is in green, is the drug trafficking routes, which I mentioned when I mentioned criminality and drug trafficking. And as you see, Panama is also a thoroughfare for trafficking drugs. And in that regard, ensuring that there is security in Panama to prevent that from happening also makes us safer. Finally, with immigration, we have this chart or this map which shows where does what's called the international migration route in Central America starts. Now, what borders with Panama? It's none other than Colombia, which is South America, where the drugs are being produced. How do they get to the centers of consumption, or where do they get through? Through Central America. These are the blue lines. And where does the journey start? In Panama. So we have the same situation with drugs and with migrants. And it is of utmost importance, I cannot say it so much, not only to ensure the security of the free transit of goods and the neutrality of the canal, but to ensure that immigration and drugs are controlled as they come through Panama, to avoid, to prevent. That is one of the keys to ensuring security and safety in our hemisphere. Once again, thank you very much, Professor Wallace, and of course, dear Professor Alexander. It's great to be with you again, and I'm so glad we've kept in touch for all these years.
Thank you very much, David, for your presentation, insight that you covered a great deal of territory, I think, within the 10 minutes or so. Obviously, you raised many questions. We're going to deal with some of the issues that you try to outline. But again, there is a very long list, and mentioning, for example, the nuclear issue, obviously, we would have to also mention, hopefully, later on, related to Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis with the Soviet Union and so forth. In other words, it's regional and interregional. So there are many other issues that obviously you could not get into it in terms of the concern, such as the climate crisis and so on. So thank you again for providing a framework for our discussion. And we would like to move on to our next speaker, according to the program that we have, Ambassador Leno Guterres, as I mentioned. And I am delighted that the ambassador, now retired, joined us. We do have the bio. It's difficult to go over the very distinguished career, but I want to simply mention that currently the retired ambassador is also practicing in terms of a consulting firm dealing with strategic advice to cooperation and those interested in Latin America. Again, the bottom line about his very distinguished service that he served 6 U.S. presidents and 11 secretaries of state related to the Latin America issues. In terms of diplomacy, for example, he was involved in very critical, I think, international cooperation, such as signing with Secretary of State Colin Powell, the Peru, I think, Inter-American Democratic Charter, and so on. But I, again, as an academic, I always try to highlight his many contributions to universities in Washington and elsewhere, including the National War College, where he occupied the famed George Kennan Chair in International Affairs, and also teaching at Johns Hopkins University. And for his work, he received many distinguished honor awards from the government and other institutions. Again, as an academic, we're grateful to him for contributing to our discussion, as well as publishing on the role of diplomacy in world affairs that we published in 2019 that he contributed a chapter including other colleagues like Ambassador John Negroponte, for example, and Von Neumann, and so on. So thank you again for joining us, and please make your presentation at that time, and we'll move on. I'm afraid I would have to leave a little bit later on after your presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alexander, and thank you to the Potomac Institute for the kind invitation. Very glad to be here. I think it's very timely and important that you all chose to focus on Latin America. You might say, why Latin America when other parts of the world appear to be burning and everything appears at first glance to be much better in Latin America? But of course, we have a shared history with Latin America. We have proximity. We are neighbors. We have shared values for the most part. Trade, $1.9 trillion in trade in the past year. But in understanding Latin America and their relationship to the United States, you have to look at history. And you have to go back to the first years of independence when the U.S. became an independent nation, after 1776, 1781, I guess, after the Battle of Georgetown. And ever since then, the United States has looked south and found a lot in common with the nations of the hemisphere. Even if you look at the first days of independence in Latin America, when Bolivar and others were leading independence movements, patriots like Belgrano carried in his knapsack the speeches of George Washington. The U.S. sent special envoys to the region before the countries were fully independent. So there's a long shared history. But that long shared history, of course, included some controversial events. You start with the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, which initially was viewed as an attempt to keep European nations out of the Western Hemisphere. But today it is not seen with a lot of adulation by Latin American countries. We had, of course, the U.S.-Mexican War in 1846, the whole Manifest Destiny movement, I guess, in the United States, Spanish-American War, 1898, which resulted in Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Marianas, and the Philippines coming into the protectorate status, I guess, of the United States, with Cuba becoming independent. And a number of incidents in the early 20th century with the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, where the United States sent troops, in many cases at the invitation of some local actors, but also to avoid countries like Germany, France, and others to return and collect the debts that they were owed by the fledgling Latin American nations. During this period, the U.S. occupied countries like Dominican Republic, 1916, 1924, Haiti, 1915, 1934, and Nicaragua had intervened several times, and other Central American nations. And my colleague already talked about Panama, so that was also a focus, of course, of then President Teddy Roosevelt to build the Panama Canal. And then you had periods of what the Latin Americans might call enlightenment, the good neighbor policy under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1933-34, when he announced to Latin America, we will no longer intervene, we want to be good neighbors. Of course, this became a double-edged sword when some of the places where we didn't intervene, the military in some of these countries saw it as a green light to take over some situations and to become entrenched, leading to the famous phrase by President Franklin Roosevelt about a dictator in the hemisphere Some say it was Somoza, some say it was Trujillo, where he said, he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. By the way, I want to apologize for not bringing PowerPoint. Like my colleagues, State Department officers are notoriously bad at doing PowerPoints, unlike our military brethren. But and since we only had 10 minutes, I figured you might as well look at my face. Be a talking head. I teach at George Washington University, and I know that millennials sometimes and Gen Zers like to see, PowerPoints and things like that. So I apologize in advance. Of course, a moment of hemispheric solidarity was during World War II and the first Rio Treaty, where all the countries of the hemisphere declared that the attack on the United States was an attack on all of the countries of the hemisphere, save for Argentina, which declared war on the Axis powers with the Allies a few miles from Paris. So there have been ups and downs in the relationship. Of course, as the previous speaker commented, the advent of revolution in 1959 with the coming of Fidel Castro, that changed the ball game totally and marked the beginning of the Cold War, essentially, when Castro aligned himself with our enemy at the time, the Soviet Union, at the height of the Cold War, when Soviet missiles were pointed at American cities. And our focus, understandably, became more of a Cold War focus at that time. The Bay of Pigs operation was a disaster. One of the instances of U.S. naivete, thinking that a formula that worked in one country can work in another. Guatemala 1954 or Iran 1955 was not Cuba in 1961. And it was a great defeat for the United States. 1962, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world was on the brink of nuclear war, is something many policymakers are looking at now, given the situation in Ukraine, where Putin has threatened to use nuclear weapons. How do we get off of that? And the Cuban Missile Crisis is an interesting case study. And then there were other interventions. Dominican Republic, 1965, when what appeared to be a pro-communist movement was gaining traction. Panama, 1979, and Grenada, 1983, when President Reagan decided to intervene after the assassination of Prime Minister Maurice Bishop. I'm sorry, Panama was 1990. I apologize. So then by 1992, 1989, 1990, all the way to 1992, you see the collapse of the Soviet Empire. Berlin Wall falls in 1989. And people like Francis Fukuyama are writing about the end of history. Things will no longer be the same. Because the world as we knew it, bipolar world, ceased to exist. Well, at that time, the reaction in Latin America was one of seeking solidarity between countries and a movement to try to establish what we call the FTAA at that time, the Free Trade Area of the Americas, which would unleash free trade from Tierra del Fuego in South America to Prudhoe Bay, Alaska. And those of us who were working on this at the time were a bit surprised at the intensity of this. Of course, it was motivated largely by NAFTA, which began as a tri-country agreement with Canada and Mexico. But we were surprised that the rest of the hemisphere, that after years of economic teachings about dependency theory and all this, wanted into the Washington Consensus at the time. So with great fanfare in 1992 in Miami, President Clinton announced the launching of the Free Trade Area of the Americas. It started with the Three Amigos, President Clinton and the Prime Minister of Canada and the President of Mexico. And pretty soon Chile joined in. And there was considerable movement. CAFTA, Central America, was negotiated. Free trade agreements with Colombia, Chile, and others, until Mar del Plata, 2005. I happened to be there at the time when the countries of Mercosur decided they would not join in the free trade agenda. Ever since then, this led, of course, later to, this was the time of the pink tide, the first pink tide in the hemisphere, populism. And you saw the phenomenon, even though the free trade area of the Americas started the beginning of the Inter-American Democratic Charter negotiations, where 34 of the 35 countries agreed that democracy should be the way of government for the hemisphere, and that dictators need not apply to the OAS, etc. But what we didn't envision was the fact that leaders, populist leaders, could attack democracy after a fair election. So you have people like Chavez in Venezuela elected in a free election, promising to end corruption, and then promising lead for his opponents. So this was, there weren't any mechanisms for this. So what do we do when people like Chavez, Aristide in Haiti, Ortega in Nicaragua try to destroy democracy from above? Well, in 2001, as Professor Alexander commented, I was with Colin Powell in Lima, Peru, at the meeting of the Organization of American States, where we were to sign the Inter-American Democracy Charter. And at this time, President George W. Bush had been in power for 6 months. And he said things like, 2001, 2002, this is going to be the year of the Americas. Very unusual for a U.S. president to give Latin America priority in its foreign policy. Vicente Fox, elected president of Mexico, came to Washington. I remember on September 7th, 2001, there was a big meeting, and the foreign minister of Mexico wanted a free trade agreement and an immigration agreement with the U.S. In his words, he said, "We want the whole enchilada," his words, not mine, about signing immigration agreements with the U.S. So it seemed to us that this was, an era of U.S. engagement. And then, of course, September 11th happened. Secretary Powell stayed long enough to sign the Democratic Charter, which was signed by acclamation. Even Chavez's Venezuela signed the Inter-American Democratic Charter. But of course, by then, the focus turned into international terrorism. And Latin America did sign a number of counterterrorism agreements at this time with the United States, very important ones. But naturally, when there's a fire in the neighborhood, you go out to put out the fire rather than having tea with your neighbors. And this is something we did in that, I don't want to use the word neglect, but Latin America was not the main focus, as President Bush had envisioned. And naturally, because we were fighting a war in Afghanistan and Iraq later on, and all these places. So when you look at the picture today, I will contend that democracy and the erosion of democracy should be the number one strategic issue for the United States in this hemisphere. And if you look at the national security strategy of the Biden administration, they say very clearly, the United States derives security and economic benefits from the region's democratic stability and institutions. So supporting democracy in the hemisphere, I think, is a number one interest. And if you're dealing with democratic governments, things are much easier for the United States. And the picture of democracy in the hemisphere, unfortunately, is a mixed one today. The Institute of Democracy has said, while democracy continues to expand, its quality is deteriorating, and threats to democracy are rising in the Western Hemisphere. you have the bright spots that we've already had, traditional democratic countries like Costa Rica, Uruguay, Ecuador, Chile, of course. On the other extreme, you have the three totalitarian, authoritarian governments, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. Others that have flirted with authoritarianism, Ecuador under Correa, Bolivia under Morales, and others. But what is more disturbing to me is the fact that there seems to be democratic fatigue in the hemisphere. In a recent poll, Latino Barometer found that only 48% of Latin Americans support democracy. There is still some, longing for the person in the white horse who's going to come in, the strong person, could be a man or a woman, to fix all the country's problems. Whereas Latin America has the highest level of participation in the world, voting and elections, 67%. And the highest percentage of women parliamentarians. The democratic fatigue is seen in that political parties are not doing as well in elections as they used to. People like Bolsonaro in Brazil could come out of nowhere and defeat the political parties, Petro in Colombia and others. And there is less trust of institutions. Corruption has been around since the days of the colonies, when the Spanish American colonists told the mother country, obedezco pero no cumplo, I obey but I do not comply, partly because Spain wasn't focused in a lot of development in the colonies. Corruption has always been around. I think what is different now is there is more of a light that shines on it. So we know about it. Many things that we were never aware of are now coming to light. There are many vulnerable countries, Haiti, Guatemala, Honduras, even Mexico and Paraguay. And, we have to look too at the traditional signs of strategic problems. In looking at the world, you might see, okay, Europe has a shooting war. In Nigeria and Africa, Boko Haram is running wild. You have Syria. You have all kinds of shooting wars going on. Latin America appears relatively calm. But Latin America is the most violence-prone region of the world. The world homicide rate is 6.1 dead per 100,000 population. In Latin America, it's the highest in the world at 17.2. Africa follows at 13.1. 37% of all homicides in the world are committed in Latin America, which has, 8% of the population. So these are things that, in Latin America are beneath the surface, but they're real problems that can affect U.S. national security, because when people don't have secure institutions in their country, they seek a better life. And the traditional route has been to go to the United States. We have talked about criminality in the region. Human trafficking is a problem. Of course, drugs have been a problem for years. And President George H.W. Bush was the first to admit that we have met part of the problem, and it is ourselves, because of the demand in the United States of 29,000 deaths due to drugs in our country. So that is something that you cannot attack one without the other, and we have to continue to do. Of course, immigration has broken records. In addition to the traditional immigration through the Mexican border of Mexico and the Northern Triangle countries, now you have Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, people escaping these countries and crossing the border. 200,000 Cubans alone across the border in the last fiscal year. So it's something that we need to continue to address with cooperation. And the recent summit of the Americas, I think 20 countries signed an agreement to cooperate on migration. I think that's a good first step. And as has been said, the problem of inequality. Latin America remains the most unequal country in the world. One out of 3 Latin Americans live under poverty, and the most unequal distribution of money in the world happens in Latin America, with a very strong and large upper elite and a very large population under poverty. So the United States, I think, has to address all these issues. But up to me, it starts with democracy. We need a vision. I think it can be agreed that since 2001, we have not paid enough attention to Latin America. And we need to, look at China. China has is playing for the long term in Latin America. Their focus is trade and investment, but it's also a geostrategic focus. Russia and Iran are mostly looking at different situations and what anti-US governments are maybe in the region and trying to get in through that way. But it's certainly something we have to take a look at. And I think it'll take something of a vision like we had with President Kennedy in the Alliance for Progress, President Roosevelt in the Good Neighbor Policy, President Reagan, Caribbean Basin Initiative. We need to offer the Latin Americans something. And I hope the Biden administration will be up to the task. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for your overview. Obviously, you raised some very critical issues. Again, the role of democracy, how it is critical to deal with the issues that democracies face, not only in Latin America, but around the world. And I recall while you were speaking about the attack, I think, in Colombia in 1985, when more than 100 people died in the M19 capture of the Supreme Court building. And this rings a bell as to the threat, not only in the region, but internationally. So again, thank you very much for your remarks. Don, can you kindly take over in terms of our colleagues?
I'll be happy to. Unlike Yona, I don't believe in long introductions. However, I'll give all of you a minute or two to read Andrew Rudman's biography, which is in very small type, which is why I suggested you read it rather than I. But as we say in the law, res ipsa loquitur. Mr. Rudman he'll speak for himself, and we will be aware of his distinction. So why don't you proceed, Mr. Rudman, and welcome.
Okay, thanks very much. I appreciate that. Dr. Wallace, Dr. Alexander, thank you both so much for the opportunity to join you this afternoon, and to my colleagues on the panel. It's really a pleasure to be here this afternoon. My presentation is going to be a little bit different than the two previous, in that I'm going to talk specifically about Mexico. So I suppose to some extent, maybe it's a case study, and I think some of the themes and points that were raised in the last two presentations may come through with specific reference to Mexico. When I think about security concerns in Mexico, I tend to think about security in two different ways, or two aspects. You have national security, which for Mexico means threats posed from organized crime, many of which were mentioned earlier, trafficking in drugs and weapons and other contraband, as well as trafficking in humans, migrants and others. And then you have personal security, by which I mean crimes such as femicide, homicide, attacks on journalists and other members of society. And I think another distinction is that the national security issues tend to have more of a bilateral or multilateral dimension, whereas the personal security issues tend to be domestic or national issues, but obviously all connected in terms of the sense of a country's security. So starting with national security, organized crime, drug trafficking, money laundering, smuggling, as I mentioned, of contraband and of people through Mexico is a longstanding challenge. Current President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, who everyone refers to as AMLO, didn't create the problems, but he did promise in his 2018 presidential campaign to end the war on drugs and confront organized crime through a strategy he called hugs not bullets, or abrazos no balazos in Spanish. So before I jump into that, I thought I would just show you a couple slides just to give you a sense of some of the crime numbers and the insecurity numbers in Mexico. So let's see if this works correctly. Can you all see that? Okay, I saw a couple thumbs up. That'll work. So if we start, I'll just do these quickly. If you look at homicide rates, you can see that it's not like there weren't homicides in the three administrations prior to this one, but obviously a big increase in homicides. The femicide rate under Lopez Obrador is certainly on pace to exceed the rate from President Peña Nieto, his predecessor. Journalists killed in each administration also likely to exceed past numbers under this administration. And then rates of confiscation of opioids, which you see a huge jump over the last administration. Obviously, some of that is due to just shifts in what people are trying to obtain, what people are looking to get access to. You would see similar increases in CBP or U.S. Customs and Border Protection data as well, where seizures have gone up a couple of years ago from around 4,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 pounds to about 12,000 pounds now. Okay, so that's just to give you kind of a sense of what some of the numbers look like. But let me talk a little bit now about what AMLO has tried to do and how that connects to, or how cooperating with the U.S. has been part of that strategy. AMLO's presidential campaign was based on the belief that the poor and those in rural areas, marginalized people in Mexico, had been neglected by successive Mexican, quote unquote, neoliberal governments. And he promised to address their concerns and to create a more equitable country. And in the realm of security, as I said, that meant hugs, not bullets, or to put it another way, to address the root causes of insecurity by creating opportunities, adopting preventive measures instead of direct confrontation with the drug cartels. AMLO's National Peace and Security Plan combined anti-corruption measures, economic policies, enhanced human rights protections, public health measures, including treatment for drug abuse and exploration of legalization, transitional justice, and amnesty for some criminals. His social approach to presenting violence also included creation of a new civilian National Guard to replace the federal police. I think addressing root causes is not in and of itself a bad idea. In fact, that's what we talk about all the time when you talk about migration across the Western Hemisphere, is attacking the root causes. But I think the challenge is that addressing root causes is a long-term, long-range solution. And we often need or want immediate solutions. So we want short-term solutions to a long-term problem, would be another way to put it. AMLO may have been correct to criticize the overemphasis on the kingpin strategy employed by former President Calderon that led to a dramatic increase in violence as different elements of the cartels fought against each other and led to splintering of the cartels as opposed to elimination of the cartels and of the violence. So cooperation, as I imagine you're all aware, cooperation between Mexico and the U.S. has long been both a necessity and a challenge, at least from the perspective of the Mexican president. And consistent with his rejection of many past strategies, Lopez Obrador called for an end to the Merida Initiative, which had been established by Presidents George W. Bush and Felipe Calderon in 2007. The Merida Initiative was intended to govern bilateral cooperation to dismantle criminal organizations, strengthen rule of law in Mexico, modernize the border, and help violence-ridden communities. But AMLO was distrustful of the U.S., and he feared greater interference in Mexican domestic issues, especially when Biden took office. President Trump had largely maintained a hands-off approach to Mexico's domestic affairs, and AMLO did not expect similar silence from the Biden administration. The mistrust during the AMLO administration goes back at least as far, and this would be the perspective of the U.S. looking at Mexico. The distrust goes back at least as far as the ill-fated attempt by the Mexican armed forces to arrest Chapo Guzman's son in Culiacan, Mexico. There's a longer story. The short story is that heavily armed cartel members basically forced the armed forces to retreat, leaving Guzman behind. That raid, that whole operation had occurred with some support from DEA. The relationship deteriorated further. You could say the Mexican side perhaps started to develop even greater mistrust after the October 2021 arrest in the U.S. of Mexican former Secretary of Defense Cienfuegos. He was charged with collaborating with the H2 cartel to smuggle cocaine, heroin, synthetic drugs, and marijuana. Mexico reacted angrily. It led ultimately DOJ to drop the case and allow Cienfuegos to return to Mexico. Shortly thereafter, the Mexican Attorney General announced he'd found no grounds on which to charge Cienfuegos. And Lopez Obrador then released some of the confidential DEA documents, which had been shared by DOJ with the Mexicans to justify their decision to arrest Cienfuegos. AMLO's government subsequently took additional punitive steps against DEA, but I'll just for now say that cooperation between our countries was undermined by the two incidents I mentioned and others. And U.S. law enforcement officials with whom we've spoken have often expressed concern about the complete near loss of trust between U.S. and Mexican law enforcement agencies. But despite the tensions and recognition of the need to collaborate between our two countries to address the shared challenges, the U.S. and Mexico have agreed to develop a program to replace the Merida Initiative. In September of last year, in 2021, during the first ever high-level security dialogue, the U.S. and Mexico announced the Bicentennial Framework for Security, Public Health, and Safe Communities. And just parenthetically, the bicentennial refers to the fact that December 12th of this year marks 200 years of U.S.-Mexico diplomatic relations. One of the key features of the framework is that for the first time, it addresses both countries' priorities. For the U.S., that's reduction of fentanyl overdoses, of which there were over 100,000 last year. And for Mexico, reduction of arms trafficking flowing from the U.S. into Mexico. The framework and the high-level security dialogue, which is an interagency dialogue intended to ensure communication, is intended in general to rebuild trust and recognize the shared nature of our challenges. Our countries have committed to transforming their cooperation to better protect the health and safety of our citizens, prevent criminal organizations from harming our countries, and to pursue and bring criminal organizations to justice through an interagency effort. And there I'm quoting INL Assistant Secretary Robinson, who spoke at the Wilson Center last month after the high-level security dialogue. Another part of security cooperation I think is important to mention with respect to Mexico is the increasing involvement of the Mexican armed forces in law enforcement activity, as well as a number of other activities that are not traditionally military responsibilities. In 2019, AMLO delivered on his promise, as I mentioned, to create a civilian National Guard. And though 70% or so of its members were military officers and soldiers, the Guard itself reported to the Secretary of Security and Civilian Protection. Much of the National Guard, though, wound up being diverted in response to pressure from President Trump to control the flow of migrants northbound, and continues to have a heavy role in migration control. It's not been terribly successful in its efforts to reduce criminal activity. The Guard is still undertrained, it's very much underarmed in comparison to the cartels. And further, and in keeping with this idea of hugs, not bullets, the Guard and the rest of the armed forces have often been constrained in their ability to respond to armed actions by the cartels. And AMLO has even gone as far as to point out that cartel members have mothers too. In August of this year, AMLO's congressional majority, with the cooperation of the opposition pre-party, adopted legislation placing the Guard back under the Secretary of Defense, returning it to the armed forces, where, as I mentioned, most of its members had come. Opposition leaders and civil society groups have pledged to challenge the constitutionality of the measure in the Supreme Court. Around the same time, Congress also voted to extend the Army's presence in the streets for an additional 5 years, that is until 2028. So given the traditional reluctance of the Mexican Army to cooperate with its US counterparts, this decision could further complicate operational collaboration between our countries. So there's a lot more we could talk about in terms of militarization and the role, and as I said, the entrance of the Mexican military into non-military tasks. But let me talk, just to try to keep things on track, talk quickly about personal security. And here, as I said, I'm thinking about violence committed by perpetrators who aren't really part of a cartel or a transnational criminal organization, but more what we call sort of common criminals. And the two types of crimes I'm thinking of are attacks on journalists and on women. We start with journalists. I showed you the slide about the increase in deaths of journalists in Mexico. Mexico is now the most dangerous country in the world for journalists, apart from countries that are in the midst of a war. So far this year, at least 13 journalists have been assassinated. This will make this year likely the most deadly for journalists in the past 22 years. During AMLO's tenure so far, which for those of you who don't follow Mexican politics in detail, it's a 6-year term. So he started in 2018 and his term will end in 2024. During his about 4 years so far, 37 journalists have been murdered, and that exceeds the figures for the Fox, Calderon, and Peña Nieto administrations, which preceded him. Equally concerning is that AMLO has largely ignored journalists' expressions of concern for their safety. Some argue that his messaging, especially his comments and actions during his daily press conferences, actually have exacerbated the violence. And I think, even if it doesn't lead to deaths, AMLO's attacks on journalists and on a free and independent press are significant threats to Mexican democracy that U.S. officials should be raising. Ambassador Gutierrez just mentioned, talked about that in general terms. I also mentioned violence against women, and that's an issue that we're addressing at the Mexico Institute through an initiative called Engendering Safety, Addressing Femicide in Mexico. Femicide rates under the AMLO administration have also spiked. 10 women are assassinated daily. Impunity, improper implementation of public policy, and insufficient funding dedicated to women's programs account for a large part of the rise in femicide. According to the Ministry of Security and Citizen Protection, 2021 was the most violent year against women in Mexican history, with a total of 1,016 murders. In several of his morning press conferences, AMLO has blamed the violence against women on a, quote, crisis of values provoked by neoliberalism model. The news, though, isn't all bad. Several Mexican states have changed their penal codes to include femicide as a distinct crime and have created special prosecutors' offices to investigate and prosecute femicide. The definition of femicide varies among states, so it's difficult to know exactly how many cases there are in the country. In addition, at the federal level, the Mexican Senate established a special commission to investigate cases of femicide of girls and adolescents, with which we worked last month to organize a full-day forum on femicide to discuss and present policy recommendations to reduce or eradicate femicide. Several state legislatures are interested in replicating the forum. So awareness, which is incredibly important to reducing femicide, is in fact growing in Mexico. Just to wrap up, the security challenges facing Mexico are considerable. They're not easily resolved or quickly resolved. There's I think, an obvious thing we almost don't need to say how much Mexican security is related to U.S. national security. The trust between law enforcement agencies in both countries has been severely undermined. And as I know all of you know, it is much easier to break trust than it is to reestablish it. But that is in fact essential, and the USG is committed to working with the López Obrador administration for the remainder of its time to address the challenges when and where possible. And there may be more opportunities for cooperation at the state level, at least in the short term. On the personal security front, pressure from civil society, from activists, NGOs is essential if Mexico is going to reduce femicide and improve protection of journalists. As I mentioned, these are largely domestic issues as opposed to the cartel type issues. But I think the US government, and here I actually mean both the executive and the legislative branches, and civil society for that matter, can engage by providing technical assistance, training, best practice sharing for those officials in Mexico responsible for investigating and preventing femicide, for example. On this and on the question of attacks on journalists, the US government, I think, should be much more vocal about the importance of protecting a free and independent press, even if the López Obrador administration accuses it of intervention. I think these are long-held values. Again, Ambassador Gutierrez made reference to this, and I think we should not be afraid to defend those values, even if it creates, if you will, a little bit of political turmoil. I'm going to stop there and look forward to the discussion that follows in a little bit. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Rodman. That was extremely interesting, but let's leave time for discussion after the next two speakers, and I'll maybe push them a bit and we get back into some of this. Professor Suchlichi, are you there?
He still seems to have the connection issues in terms of the sound. So maybe we proceed to Mr. Zagaris and then we continue.
Okay, well, I know Bruce Zagaris well. Could we put his CV up briefly? And could he enlarge it a little bit? Thanks. I'll let you read it. I've known Bruce for many years. He's a very active practitioner in Washington. His specialty is, among others, international criminal law. In the light of what Mr. Rudman has said, and to some extent what Ms. Rahi said, it's an important subject, unfortunately. Bruce, welcome.
Thank you. I'm going to try to, share my screen.
Okay, we see it.
Okay, so I'm going to focus on the subject of illicit firearms trafficking. Some of it will complement Mr. Rudman's talk, but first I also want to just say how fantastic it has been to work over the years with both Dr. Alexander, the pioneer in international terrorism, combating, I should say, international terrorism, and also Professor Wallace, who has, created the International Law Institute and has collaborated with Yonah on many of these topics. So
thank you, Bruce.
I'm going to look at four things on how to combat illicit firearm trafficking. The first is the role of international conventions. The second is the need to hold gun manufacturers and distributors accountable. The third is the need to go after the money in terms of the trade. And the fourth is the role of international human rights in this issue. So let's look first then at the participation in the main international conventions. There are three main international conventions on this issue. The first is the Inter-American Convention, of which 31 OAS members have signed, but only 3 countries are not participating: the US, Canada, and Jamaica. Second main convention is the Firearms Protocol to the Palermo Convention against transnational organized crime. That has 122 participants, including the EU, but the US, again, is not participating in this. And then the third main treaty, of course, is the UN Arms Trade Treaty, which has 110 participants. And the US is one of the 54 countries that have not participated. And since most of the source of the firearms trafficking is the US, it accounts for anywhere from 70 to 90% of the firearms trafficking, whether you're talking about Mexico, Haiti, Brazil, the Northern Triangle. The US is the source. So I think it's very important that civil society and all other interested parties try to make sure that the US ratify these conventions and also effectively implement them. And that's one of the things that Mexico now has really taken the bull by the horns in terms of the problem. In particular, it has started going after the gun manufacturers and distributors. And they're, of course, motivated by one thing, and that's the money that they make. In the US, when a company manufactures a product that is inherently or negligently dangerous, and especially when there are ways to reduce the danger, and those manufacturers choose not to take advantage of it, they're held liable. And there have been some successful suits, but they've been unraveled by Congress. In particular, Congress enacted the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, which has the express purpose of basically giving immunity from civil liability to the firearm industry for the criminal use of its products, although there are a couple of exceptions. That is when the manufacturers design or market the products illegally. And so the Mexican government has brought an action in the District of Massachusetts, the U.S. District of Massachusetts. And they've brought it because they've shown that the 6 manufacturers are designing the guns for the cartels. That case, however, was dismissed on September 30 of this year. Judge Saylor said that the PLCAA, the law that gives the gun manufacturers immunity, forced him to dismiss the case. Mexico has said it's going to appeal. It's going to appeal because the complaint and what it has submitted shows that the manufacturers have knowingly designed and marketed their guns, and when we talk about guns, we're talking about submachine guns and automatic weapons. These are basically weapons of war. And the Mexican government on appeal is also going to say that this law should not apply to cases involving violations of foreign law, namely the tough Mexican laws on firearms. And also, they're going to argue that it should not be applied extraterritorially. Now, already, even on the trial level, some governments in the Western Hemisphere have intervened as amicus, and also some civil society organizations have already intervened. I think that more governments in the hemisphere and also other civil society organizations should also intervene at the Fourth Circuit level, because it's very important to hold U.S. gun manufacturers and distributors liable. On October 10, the Mexican government filed another case, this time in the U.S. District Court in Arizona, against the distributors, because the distributors are selling these weapons of war in bulk to straw purchasers, knowing that the straw purchasers are going to then distribute them in Mexico. Second way, or third way of attacking the illicit firearms trafficking is for international organizations such as the Financial Action Task Force to make financing illicit firearms trafficking a priority. Already, it looks at money laundering, terrorist financing, and nuclear proliferation financing. However, until now, for some reason, it hasn't looked at the trafficking of illicit firearms, even though, as we heard from Mr. Rudman, this is an important factor in the enormous growth of homicides and femicides, and also it is fueling the cartels which are involved not only in narcotics but human trafficking and other migration and transnational organized criminality. The FATF should also do typologies on illicit firearms trafficking. And by prioritizing this and doing typology reports, it will make countries, financial institutions, and other players responsible. Finally, the fourth thing that can be done with respect to attacking illicit firearms trafficking is the human rights approach. So, for instance, just about a month ago, the Inter-American Human Rights Commission held a hearing on illicit firearms trafficking, and there were most of the governments in the hemisphere are demanding that something be done. And increasingly, the world is focusing attention on the nexus between the availability of small arms and the perpetration of violent acts on a large scale. So we've seen these mass murders increase significantly. And so increasingly, civil society has been bringing suits based on human rights and humanitarian law. So this is the right to life and the right to be free from violent attacks. So you're going to see this be used much more frequently in both international human rights tribunals and courts. There's a lot of there's a proliferation of academic scholarship now on this issue, and civil society has gone to court in places like the UK to stop arms trafficking, to countries like Saudi Arabia with respect to the problem in the civil war in Yemen. And so this is a fourth way. But let me stop here because I want to leave plenty of time for comments and Q&A. And it's been a real honor and a pleasure to be with my distinguished panel. And so I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Kevin, where do we stand with our last speaker, Professor Suplicy?
I'm here. I don't know if you can hear me.
Oh, yeah, well, we can definitely hear you. Welcome. Sorry we can't see you, but I've been saying before that, unlike Yona, I don't believe in long introductions, but your written CV is available. Kevin, could you expand it a bit? And I'll let the panelists and the audience read it. I see that you were born in Cuba, come to the United States. You're currently director of the Cuban Studies Institute in Coral Gables. I see you had a distinguished career dealing with Cuban and other matters. I'll let the audience and the panel read your CV for another minute or two. I see your last entry is he is the author of Mexico, from Montezuma to the Rise of the PAN, which I believe is the party which is not in power right now, and A Brief History of Cuba. So I think at this point, if I may, I will call on you to speak. And if you need to have any documents, put on the screen, my colleagues will do that. So welcome and
All right, can you hear me?
yes, clearly.
Okay, good. Look, I want to thank you all and thank you for your patience. I just found out that Miami has declared its independence from the United States, and that's why we had some problems with the equipment. All right. In terms of Latin America, Cuba, for the past 60 years, has been an enemy of the United States, using whatever manners or equipment or modality to oppose the United States, including terrorism, including joint ventures with the Soviet Union, including inviting the Soviet Union to bring nuclear missiles to Cuba. This is the result of Castro's own perception in the world, his own anti-Americanism, which goes back to the independence of Cuba and the fact that his father was a Spaniard that opposes U.S. involvement in Cuba. Castro, as a high school student, was impacted by fascist ideas and Falangista ideas at Belen Jesuit High School. And while he was in the mountains fighting for power and opposing the Batista regime, he wrote to some of his allies and friends, my biggest struggle is going to be against the United States once I come to power, and I pledge to fight against the United States. So Cuba has been an enemy, and I think that that is maybe the overarching factor in most of these terrorism activities, except drugs naturally has a component that is the monetary component. But I mean, many of the activities of these leaders throughout the world has to do with the United States. Cuba, in the past 2 decades, has created a very close alliance with Iran and Venezuela and has provided intelligence, training, help to the Hezbollah and the Iranians, and has facilitated their activities in Latin America. Let me run through some of the points that I would like to elaborate, but I'm not going to make it briefly. Cuba provides intelligence to Hamas and Hezbollah. Hezbollah, on orders from Hassan Nasrallah, has set up an operational base in Cuba that is working and still exists. Cuba and Venezuela fundraise for Hezbollah, and all of this is part of the Cuba-Venezuela alliance. Recently, Cuban military officers are acting as liaison between the Venezuelan military and the narco guerrillas of the Colombian FARC. Cuban General Leonardo Ramon Andoyo, Chief of Operation of the Cuban Ministry of the Armed Forces, has visited Venezuela several times and has acted as a go-between the Cuban and Venezuelan military. The FBI estimates that Cuba has provided safe harbor to dozens of fugitives from the United States and terrorists from all over the world. The macheteros from Puerto Rico, the Fuerzas Armadas de Liberación Nacional from Colombia, the other groups from like we mentioned, the Hezbollah and Hamas have used Cuba. Venezuela has also provided Cuba with duplicates, dyes, and forms to provide allies of Cuba papers to enter Latin America. So we have seen a growth of Arabs, Middle Eastern, Hezbollah, Hamas groups entering Latin America with falsified passports done by the Cuban government. The Tupamaros, the Venezuelan group that beat up students in Venezuelan street, were trained by the Cubans. And not only that, Venezuela is now providing training for terrorists and anti-American activists in Latin America. And it is coming out of not Cuba, but primarily Venezuela. There's another factor that has remained in the table for a number of years now. In 1996, the Cuban Air Force shut down in international waters two civilian unarmed planes and killed 4 Americans, Fidel Castro and Raul Castro. Both of them acknowledged their responsibility and accepted personal responsibility for the shutdown of the 2 planes. Yet nothing has been done. The United States has complained, but nothing has been done yet. Let me finish with one thought here, which is the fact that last week, Díaz-Canel, the acting president of Cuba, visited Putin in Russia. And we have seen in the past few years an interest of Russia to extending their naval activities through the Caribbean and into Latin America. I presume that besides a handout, Díaz-Canel is probably offering the Soviet Union the possibility of using Cuban ports for nuclear submarines and surface vessels from Russia. If this is what to happen, and I am sure it's going to happen, we will have a confrontation again with the United States. Nuclear submarines are dangerous. Close to the United States will represent a security threat to the U.S. interests, and the United States will react violently. Let me leave it here, and hopefully there will be some questions that we can answer.
Thank you very much. Usually at this point, Yona asked me to make some remarks, but I will not. I'd rather that you would comment on each other. A lot has been covered, so you can begin in any way you wish. If you raise your hand, I'll recognize you. And then I'll ask Kevin or Gurgen to see if there are any questions from other participants, if you would do that. I don't know who's tracking that, but why don't we begin with discussion among yourselves, because you've raised many questions. And anyone who wishes to speak, please. In fact, I'll do it. I'm a professor, and we'll do it in a kindergarten-like way. I'll begin with the person who's closest to me, and that's David Mizrahi. So we'll ask Mizrahi to make any comments that he wishes, and then I'm inclined to then proceed to the ambassador, etc., and so forth. So David, please, if you unmute yourself.
Well, again, thank you very much, Professor Wallace, and I'm sorry that my dear Professor Alexander is no longer in the panel, because it would have been good to get his feedback, and particularly I do appreciate that he has been recognized really as the pioneer of academic studies on terrorism. So that's certainly something.
I will report your remarks to him. Have no fear.
Thank you so much. I would like to comment again, and I am actually a history buff, so I enjoyed listening to Ambassador Gutierrez run us through this very long and winding road of U.S. Latin America relationship, being that Panama has had such an important role in that, and indeed the role that the United States plays in being the guarantor of security is something that is interesting. I believe Ambassador Gutierrez touched upon that. I'm also very happily surprised that most of our talks, even though they intertwined with each other, each of us had Although we didn't plan it, there was not much repetition, meaning we touched upon each other's heels without really stumping on our feet. And that was remarkable. I wish that in other panels we do the same. We're certainly all very concerned about preserving security and about the multi-dimensional definition of what is security. Because security is not only not being killed when we walk out from our offices or our homes. Security is having economic security, having food security, and being able to live in a peaceful society regionally as good neighbors. It's a pity that outside forces are contributing to our divisions based upon political philosophies, because at the very end, there is more than unites us, having the common heritage of having lived through the colonial period and the post-colonial period, being relatively young nations in the sense that no nation in Latin America is over 250 years old. So we've grown together, and we should continue to live together in harmony, respecting each other.
Thank you, David, very much. Mr. Ambassador?
Thank you very much. And I also want to say it's a pleasure to be in this distinguished panel and having former colleagues like Andrew Rudman there, who's formerly the Foreign Service, and Dr. Suchliki, whom I've known for many years, and whose books I have used in my courses at GW. But I want to ask David, because I can't pronounce Mizrahi.
David. David is fine.
In 2000, I had to testify before Congress, Senate Armed Services Committee, on are the Chinese taking over the Panama Canal? This Hutchison Whampoa, which was a company that had supposedly Chinese controlled, but had George Shultz as chairman of the board, was bidding on some of the projects involving the canal. And in recent years, there's been talk that the Panama Canal had to modernize to allow bigger tankers in. We had a lot of hoopla in Nicaragua when Daniel Ortega announced that there would be a new canal coming in through Nicaragua with a Chinese investment. Any comment on the current viability of the canal right now?
Well, the Panama Canal has been operating as a much more efficient and profitable enterprise. It's the notion that the Americans built, rightfully so, at the beginning of the 20th century, that the canal was really a point for service. It has become a point for commerce, and it's probably the largest contributor to the Panamanian GDP, and the ecosystem built around the canal, including the ports, some of which are operated by a Chinese entity, but that doesn't mean that there are not other port operators that are not controlled by China. It's not. I believe that at some point it might have been an overstated concern. The canal is operated very efficiently. It's operated with transparency, and it's really a success story. And we have to be thankful to the United States. The United States complied with the Panama Canal treaties, returned us the most valuable infrastructure probably in the region, which is the canal and the surrounding areas, because the United States fully developed the Panama Canal Zone, and when it was turned over, it was a very valuable asset that the Republic of Panama has been able to multiply its value for society. And being that we're such a small country, we're just barely over 4 million people. Before COVID, we had the fastest rate and the most constant rate of per capita GDP growth in the region, which is remarkable for a country our size. On the side of the bilateral relationship with Panama, which is probably our most important relationship, after a few years without a Panamanian ambassador, Ambassador Aponte came to Panama. I'm sure you know her from, and Professor Rodman as well. She's already here, and she's expressed what her most important concerns as ambassadors are. So I believe we're as General Torrijos said, we're under the umbrella of the Pentagon, and that is good for security purposes.
Thank you, David. Mr. Rodman?
Well, thanks. To echo what the other panelists have said, I think this was a great conversation, and you're absolutely right, David, that we all talked about many of the same things without repeating each other, which with no planning doesn't always happen. So again, you know, as you particularly mentioned, David, we talked about security and democracy and human rights, and I think it just underscores the complexity of security. It's not, you know, it isn't that sort of traditional armed forces against invading forces from some other country. So much of it is internal, and so much of it is driven by the way people experience and live their lives, which I think another point that comes through is really the challenge to democracy that we're seeing in our country and around the hemisphere. And to me, it really is a concern that if democracy can't deliver, then voters become easily subject to populism. And I think that's a real concern. That is a security threat, I think, to every country in the hemisphere. And I guess one thought I had, or a question I'll pose back, is I think traditionally when it came to drug trafficking, the sort of conventional wisdom was the U.S. was the demand country, and all the other Latin American countries were suppliers or transit countries. And it was sort of a very binary. But my sense, I don't know if all of you share it, is that increasingly there's an awareness that there are use problems in all countries. And because particularly fentanyl is so deadly and so easy to produce, you're actually seeing production in places you didn't before. So again, thanks everybody. This was great.
Bruce, thank you very much, Mr. Rodman. Bruce?
Okay, so a couple of comments. First, interestingly, Panama has also used part of the infrastructure, namely one of the forts. I think it's Fort Belvoir. They've turned it into the Ciudad de Saber, the city of knowledge, which is an innovation hub. And there's all kinds of foreign universities, many of which are from the US, that are using the city of knowledge to do all kinds of innovative activities. Second thing is, one comment is, at the Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles, there was an agreement, protocol on migration, but three of the key countries weren't part of that, namely Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. And we've seen that in the aftermath of the Summit of the Americas, the US has had to do new things both with Venezuela and with Cuba, in part to try to, control the migration. So I'd be interested if anybody has a thought on that. And then finally, on Mr. Rudman's last comment, you see that the pattern of both the narcotics, illegal migration, and the gun trafficking is very similar, but they go in, different directions. And so, again, the question is, how do we reverse, or how do we stop this pattern, which has such a devastating effect on the whole hemisphere? But thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Professor Zulicki, are you there still?
Yes, I'm still here. Yeah.
I'll give you a minute or two, and then we'll wrap it up. I'll make a few remarks.
Okay. Basically, I want to thank all of my colleagues and put up with my patience and so on. And especially, I want to say hello to Lino Gutierrez, who I've known many years, and we work together on many things. Basically, the threats are internal and external. I don't think we can minimize external threat, whether it's from the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians. All of these actors have an eye on Latin America as a vehicle to put pressure on the United States. So, and Russia in particular want to use ports in Latin America to bring their ships and create or try to create a crisis and put pressure on the United States. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a few more minutes. I don't think we have time, Kevin, to anyone from the audience. Let me just conclude. Once again, as I always say, Yona, you've assembled a wonderful panel. We've had a very rich discussion, and as was pointed out, I think, initially by Mr. Mizrahi, not too much overlap, a little bit. First, here's what I've sort of gleaned. One, the United States is awfully important for ill and good. The Monroe Doctrine undoubtedly has cast a shadow all over the world. I think the United States has evolved through FDR and otherwise, but it's a complicated phenomenon. Secondly, I agree with Suglihi that, of course, there are external realities. I mean, Cuba has been a source of trouble. The Russians and the Chinese, the Iranians and others have obviously would like to play in the field created by Castro and his successors. I think interesting, there are real problems of criminality all over the world, but apparently because of drugs, trafficking, etc., crime is awfully important. Bruce mentioned firearms. It's kind of a scandal. We produce them, others consume them, and we don't regulate it. That's why we haven't joined these. We have this obsession with the Second Amendment, misunderstood probably, to not get involved with firearms. There was one interesting case in Connecticut where the family of some of those children has collected against arms manufacturers on the ground that they were defamed. And maybe we'll see some ingenious litigation. The challenge to democracy, of course, is with us. I think we'll win that fight. I don't think the Chinese are distinguishing themselves these days in their treatment of COVID. I mean, there must be a God, because Xi is really being punished and he doesn't know what the hell to do. Ditto with Putin. He's punished himself. He doesn't know what the hell to do. So I think things are hopeful in that respect. Finally, the point which impressed me a great deal, which was made by Andrew Rudman and others, so much of the problem of security in our hemisphere is insecurity. It's the insecurity of individuals. Now, obviously, if you live in Mexico and you have the cartels everywhere, et cetera, and so forth, but this problem of what you call personal security strikes me as, and the anxiety that it generates is obviously something we have to deal with, and it's very difficult to deal with that. These are essentially domestic in their inspiration. But I must say, I think Latin America in that sense is special, Mr. Ambassador, because it's interesting. The Mexicans always say, why is God so far away and America so close? The irony is we're close, but we're not aware of our neighbors. But our neighbors are damn aware of us. And so I think we just have to constantly cope with that asymmetry, if you will. But I want to thank you all, and I will report to Yona. I know regrets enormously because he really looks forward to being in these programs from the beginning to the end. So I will report to him what I think has been a very successful panel. So again, thank you all very much. And hasta la vista.